Hi everyone, welcome to the special Indonesia Study Group seminar. Special because today we have presenters from Research Travel Grants awardees. I believe this is from round 10 of Research Travel Grants. So this is a grant provided by Indonesia Project for honors and master students, mostly to support their fieldwork in Indonesia. And today, we're grateful to have two of the awardees. The first one is Samira Lindsey from Monash University with research on corporate criminal liability in Indonesia and Australia. And second presenter is Archana Ramesh from the University of Melbourne. We will ask the grantees to present their research results. We'll start with Samira and then Archana. And then after that, we will have question and answer session. If you want to ask question, you can write your question in the Q&A box or just raise your virtual hand, and then I will call you in the Q&A session to ask directly. So with that, let me give the opportunity to Samira to start her presentation. Over to you, Samira.
Terima kasih, Pak Arianto. Thank you, everyone, for coming to listen to Archana and I speak. And thank you, Indonesia Project, for inviting me to speak. So what I will do is do my share screen. Okay. So I hope that's working. Yeah, okay. In 2017, Dudung Purwadi was convicted for bribery in the Jakarta Corruption Court. Purwadi was a director of PT Nusa Konstruksi Engineering atau NKI, a publicly trading Indonesian construction company. So the court found that Purwadi bribed a ministerial official, Nazaruddin, in exchange for NKI winning a state building contract to construct an apartment complex for the 2018 Asian Games, that is the Wisma Atlet Village. Purwadi was sentenced to 4 years and 8 months imprisonment and fined 250 million. But by 2018, NKI was also convicted by the same court on the same factual basis. 7 years earlier, we had the banknote scandal in Australia. So this involved two wholly owned subsidiaries of the Reserve Bank of Australia, Securrency and Note Printing Australia, who were investigated by the Australian. 2011, both entities were convicted under the Australian Criminal Code for conspiring to bribe officials in Indonesia as well as other countries. Together, they paid $930 million in fines. The rule of law has come to mean many things. It means equality before the law, equal punishment of all. And equitable enforcement of laws is a necessary element of rule of law. Despite this, corporations evade criminal responsibility. They renegotiate compliance with law to generate profits and economic growth. Consequently, criminal laws are being enforced against individuals, but not to the same degree against corporations. And this reflects what I call a policy of selective but not equitable law enforcement. So the question which arises is this: exactly how good is law at curbing the tide of corporate impunity? So my thesis seeks to answer this in the context of Indonesia and Australia by offering a comparative analysis of the corporate criminal liability regulatory frameworks in the two countries. So my presentation today will address three elements of my thesis. First, the research question, objectives, and design. Second, it will provide a synopsis of the substantive chapters 2 and 3. And finally, it will report on the key findings as detailed in chapter 4. So my thesis offers a comparative analysis of the corporate criminal liability regulatory frameworks in the two countries, and it identifies factors inhibiting successful prosecutions of companies for acts of bribery. And it makes recommendations for reform in Indonesia, reflecting on the Australian development. And ultimately, the thesis will demonstrate the importance of equitable enforcement in fulfilling rule of law, preventing companies from being used as vehicles to escape individual criminal responsibility. And I chose Indonesia and Australia for three reasons. First, they each follow vastly different legal systems, offering a rich point of comparison. Australia follows the British common law system, whereas Indonesia inherited the Dutch civil law tradition. Similarly, Australia follows a thick or substantive rule of law, whereas Indonesia follows thin procedural rule of law. Second, Indonesia and Australia are each other's closest neighbours. So I won't elaborate on this point, given that we haven't already with the development of the bilateral relationship, but it is a point that I did consider in choosing the two jurisdictions. And third and finally, while both jurisdictions now recognise corporate criminal liability, the development of their regulatory frameworks have evolved at different paces. So this will be discussed in due course, but I do want to make the point here that companies were not historically capable of corporate criminal liability, but this has now emerged in many jurisdictions, including Australia and Indonesia. So my thesis uses a qualitative analysis of corporate criminal liability statute and literature. So I selected a judgment from each country, which I then treated as a case study for analysis. Many of the primary resources were in Indonesian, so I was grateful for the Indonesia project funding, which enabled me to obtain professional translations of judgments and regulations. And as detailed in chapter 1 of my thesis, my research is grounded in Peerenboom's method of qualitative analysis, comparative qualitative analysis, which treats the rule of law not only as a constitutional concept, but also as a theoretical framework itself. Now, this allows for a nuanced comparison for two reasons. First, it recognizes that the content of rule of law is is a heavily contested concept. And second, it accepts that while there is no consensus as to the content, that rule of law is manifested in two ways, thick and thin. The thick-thin dichotomy is necessary to address because both forms of rule of law identify equitable law enforcement as a necessary criterion of rule of law. Chapter 1 argues that corporate impunity reflects or leads to selective rather than equitable enforcement. It argues that companies should not be permitted to renegotiate compliance with law in order to pursue business. The chapter concludes by identifying 3 barriers to equitable and effective enforcement, and this emerges from literature. So the first barrier is a disorganized or confusing statutory scheme owing to a multiplicity of statutes recognizing corporate criminal liability and or the omission of corporate criminal liability from the main source of substantive law, for example, a penal code. The second barrier is a lack of a clear process attributing liability from individuals to corporations. And this is primarily due to poor legislative drafting, failing to distinguish individual from corporate criminal responsibility. And the third barrier is an inadequacy of sanctions in achieving deterrence and or addressing harm caused to victims. Ultimately, the question is, do the institutions of enforcement operate effectively and fairly? The method by which criminal responsibility is attached or attributed to corporations in Australia is unique compared to other models in other jurisdictions. So Part 2.2 of the Criminal Code, which is found in the Criminal Code Act, sets out the general principles of criminal responsibility for individuals. However, Part 2.5 governs corporate defendants. It is widely considered a model law for corporate criminal liability. Under Part 2.5, the physical element of an offence is attributed to the corporation under Section 12.2. Now, the fault element, the trickier element, is attributed under Section 12.3. This section recognises established categories of fault, including intention, knowledge, and recklessness. Negligence is also recognised under Section 12.4. But the interesting thing about Section 12.3 is that it also creates a new category of fault known as corporate culture. Ultimately, the Australian Criminal Code provides for the seamless prosecution of individuals and corporations for the same offence. For example, the bribery offence, sanctions and attribution provisions are all contained in the Australian Criminal Code. And we see this with the prosecution of security and note printing. So I'll now turn to corporate criminal liability in Indonesia. Compared to Australia, the corporate criminal regulatory framework in Indonesia is far less developed. For over a century, corporations were not subject to criminal law, and this is a legacy of colonial rule, which did not recognise corporations as capable of criminal responsibility. However, today there are approximately 120 specific purpose laws which do recognise corporate criminal liability in Indonesia. However, there is no procedural law which adequately enables regulators, such as the Corruption Eradication Commission, the KPK, to prosecute companies. There have been attempts at reform. For example, there was a draft criminal code, which was most recently considered in 2015, which contained draft corporate criminal liability provisions. This draft code failed. More recently, the Attorney General and the Supreme Court have introduced their own regulations, as you can see on the slide, and these regulations purport to enable corporate prosecution. But there are problems with these regulations. To name just three, first, the regulations are very low ranking on Indonesia's hierarchy of laws, and they are possibly not binding on prosecutors and judges. Second, the regulations conflict with the specific purpose laws and possibly with each other. And third, the regulations conflate individual with corporate liability. So there's a clear lack of an effective attribution process altogether. Now, the prosecutions of Pawadi and NKI demonstrate that corporate criminal liability can work in Indonesia, but there are problems with the regulatory landscape. So this brings me to my research findings. Chapter 4 of my thesis has three aims. First, it identifies similarities and differences between corporate criminal liability in the two countries, and that's by reference to the three barriers to enforcement that I previously outlined. Second, it argues that the imperative for reform of corporate criminal liability is greater in Indonesia than it is in Australia. And third, the chapter proposes two avenues for reform in Indonesia. So I'll turn first to look at the similarities and differences. As we can see from the table, the Indonesian system lacks many of the elements present in the Australian. So I've already discussed features 3, 4, and 5, so attribution of the physical and fault elements and distinguishing between individual and corporate liability. I will turn first, though, to the two features listed first in the table to emphasise that the Australian Criminal Code provides a uniform law governing substantive and procedural law for both individuals and corporations. In Indonesia, there is no such holistic process. In relation to the sixth feature, I would highlight that there has been only one successful enforcement action for bribery by a corporation in each country. But the companies pleaded guilty, so there was no need for the courts to interpret or discuss the application of corporate criminal liability principles. As a result, there is a lack of judicial guidance which can aid the enforcement process, including the interpretation of the attribution provision. And I'll turn now to the final factor on the table. In Indonesia, while the primary sanction is a monetary fine and restitution payable to the state, the courts can consider victims and also order compensation. Comparably, in Australia, there is less emphasis on victims, However, in saying this, in 2020, the Australian Law Reform Commission, which is the national peak body for law reform, has recommended reforms impacting at least sentencing that are more victim-centric. So my thesis argues that the imperative for reform is greater in Indonesia than it is in Australia for two reasons. First, literature indicates that Indonesia is a weak governance zone. It suffers from pervasive corruption, political instability, and local conflict, whereas Australia is comparably a robust regulatory system with stable institutional frameworks, or relatively stable. Second, the deficiencies in the Australian system are already being redressed as reform is now advanced. For example, the Australian Law Reform Commission made its inquiry and has already published recommendations in 2020. So what remains to be seen is how far the reforms will go, to what extent will they be implemented, if at all. My thesis does make two proposals for reform. First, it proposes that for the Indonesian context, there be a uniform fit-for-purpose law, which should displace the various statutes to be modelled off the Australian Criminal Code, but incorporating the Law Reform Commission's recommendations, as well as a modification to address the corporate culture provisions. And this is because what is meant by corporate culture, or even just the term culture, is ambiguous, particularly when you transfer that to the Indonesian context, where we're looking at such a pluralistic society and a complicated legal system. So defining what is meant by corporate culture needs to be more precise than it is in the Australian legislation. And the second proposal for reform is the creation of a new regulatory mandate of why not prosecute corporations. So this type of policy of why not prosecute was seen in Australia and was implemented by the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. And it was seen as a more aggressive and proactive approach to enforcing crime. So whether a similar policy tailored to the Indonesian regulator could be applied might lead to more effective and equitable enforcement of corporate criminal liability in Indonesia. So ultimately, what emerges from my thesis is an understanding that effective and equitable law enforcement is predicated on a functioning statutory regime. The law should enable but not hinder enforcement of laws in a fair and equal way. So a system that overregulates individuals but underregulates corporations is not an equitable one. To an extent, Australia is now in a good position to fulfill equitable law enforcement compared to Indonesia, which still faces significant barriers to enforcement. However, it must be remembered that there are similarities, including that Australia and Indonesia both demonstrate limited success in prosecuting corporations for bribery. So that concludes my presentation. I'll just stop the screen sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samira, for very interesting results. And with that, let's move on to the next presenter, and that would be Archana Ramesh from the University of Melbourne. Archana, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Samira. That was really interesting. And I think we sort of share a common theme across our thesis, where you talk about equity. We touching on land equity and housing and such urban sort of issues. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Yeah, just confirming that you can see my screen. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Before I begin, I sort of would like to thank the Indonesia project for funding the research for this project under difficult circumstances that we've all been through. So before I begin, I'd like to thank Dr. Amanda Ahmadi and Dr. Sid Sinthasinghe, who put together and led the traveling studio to Bandung, Indonesia, also for their guidance and support, which paved the way for this project and solidified my commitment to the topic I'll be addressing today. I'll begin by acknowledging the residents of kampungs in Indonesia, whose stories of space this thesis is based on. Structurally, the thesis is in part a critique of the current urban and architectural practices in Bandung, and in part is research that culminates with design. Kampung or kampung kota translates to urban villages. In the context of this thesis, kampungs were originally rural settlements, now engulfed by the city as a result of rapid urbanization. The thesis contends that kampungs are neither synonymous with slums, nor can they be claimed as undeveloped. Development and progress, on the other hand, two ideas that are appropriated by neoliberal economies and politics in post-colonial cities of South and Southeast Asia, are increasingly being represented through architecture as their poster child. In Bandung, they've taken the shape of elevated walkways, river corridor projects, high-rise apartments, and malls. Kampungs that occupy prime or urban land are easy praise to development projects, given their negative symbolic capital and unclear land rights. My thesis, titled Middle Ground, takes on the evils of development, displacement of the urban vulnerable, and erasure of social systems. At an ideological level, it challenges the perception of development, questioning development of what and for whom. In the face of evict, demolish, replace mechanisms adopted by development, the thesis calls for an alternative framework with in situ replacement based on co-production. It postulates an architectural framework that's contextual, operating with local practice of space. A Google Earth survey between 2010 and 2020 unearthed about 1,109 kampung households having been displaced in Bandung. A ballroom, a hotel, a mall, and close to 5,000 apartments have been built in its place, yet only 16 kampung households have been offered replacement in situ. A growing disconnection has been observed between urban sprawl and population growth. Land consumption per capita has steadily increased, even with the kampungs being taken over by high-density vertical housing with a ratio of 1:4. Kampung residents, either coerced or forcefully evicted, are compensated through an offering of fixed tenure renting in low-income vertical public housing called Rusunawa, located on the urban fringes. In the case of my examples, some 15 to 30 kilometers away from their original location. Rental expenses, inaccessible employment force the displaced to move back to other kampungs in the city, leading to further densification and a decreased quality of living. The seeming dichotomy between development and the kampung cannot be better exemplified than in the site on which the thesis is anchored. The site used to be a kampung in the north of Bandung, an area overexposed to consumer culture with the presence of a popular shopping strip and Chiwok Mall, designed by Denton Corker Marshall, Jakarta, and Terrace Ciampelas, a dilapidating elevated walkway modeled after the High Line in New York. In 2011, the mall developer bought the adjacent land, which was on lease to the kampung residents. And since then, incremental eviction has occurred, evicting residents who'd built permanent structures and lived in them for over 40 years. With a lone house standing, approximately 96 households have been displaced for the expansion of the mall. 30 more residents adjacent to the site face eviction in the future for a greenwashing agenda in the form of a river corridor, disguised as development under the World Bank-backed City Without Slums or Kotaku program, which selectively leaves out the formalized cul-de-sac that also shares its border with the river. Co-production as a practice, and I deviate from the European context here, is different stakeholders producing place together. I argue that for a development of this scale that has displacement as its consequence, it is essential for architecture to rethink its practice and to operate beyond the boundaries of the site and of a given brief. The agency of architecture is in bringing different stakeholders to the table to put together their aspirations. I draw on local examples where networks of social capital, systems of self-governance, and co-production of spaces are evident in the many collective measures of the kampung community that takes shape and manages the built environment. Whether it is negotiating a deal with the government to undergo voluntary partial eviction to build a co-house, or setting up hand wash stations in critical locations in times of COVID. So middle ground relies on this demonstrated capacity of the community to propose a self-organized collective to negotiate co-production as an alternate to the current mechanism, particularly as private ownership of the site remains in effect and legal recourse is ineffective or slow at best. A partnership between the developer, the government, and the kampung collective can form an effective alternative. Kampung residents voluntarily give up their homes for replacement options in the new development. Quick turnover and reduced liability drive the developer to offer housing for kampung residents in the development, which is made affordable by the government subsidies, whose public river corridor is negotiated to form a support system to the kampung collective. Demonstrated here is a practice framework corresponding to the context. Crucial not just in identifying affected stakeholders, but to create an inclusionary process of architecture and urban development, but also in understanding how to engage with and respond to the diverse aspirations of the stakeholders and arrive at collective solutions, in this case, co-production. The method of co-production and the socio-economic and spatial relationships and interdependencies shared between the stakeholders is illustrated in this diagram. The inner core is made up of active stakeholders or co-producers of space, the developer and the kampung residents. The designer, the architect, and the local government end up becoming the passive stakeholders, followed by transient users. The spatial manifestation of co-production at an urban scale maximizes opportunities to connect existing but very disparate systems of infrastructure and services for the holistic development of the area. Seen here is sanitation, green areas, and circulation at a neighborhood scale work in tandem to provide an urban continuum of systems. This connection is translated onto a site plan where pedestrian connectivity is established between the elevated walkway on the left, terrestrium pillars, and the kampung on the right. The private road to the mall is deprivatized and is connected to the public road Jalan Plesiran, seen in the south there. So formal commercial area can be placed along its interface. Open spaces are planned in conjunction with Jalan Plesiran, which is a high footfall area, and with the Green River Corridor project in the north. With respect to the morphology of the architecture itself, the model on the left illustrates the typical form of gated residential developments, a large-scale reorganization of life of centralized stacked living within boundaries separated from the street. The kampung on the right is an antithesis to the residential developments. The forms of the kampung are connected to the street or the alley, and the alley is constantly negotiated and shared between residents. The kampung informs the decentralized porous morphology for the middle ground. The scale of the mega is diminished, and enclosure is replaced by porosity that allows for socioeconomic forces of the city to seep through. In responding to the loss of social system at an architectural scale, the thesis draws on spatial information from field-based research. Conversations with residents and observations on site were key in unraveling the workings of social systems. Through an architectural and urban ethnography, I was asking what about the spatialities make it conducive to social systems? At a basic level, for the kids to gather to play, for a shop to be run from a window, what makes a vegetable vendor stop and have a long chat with a customer? Porches, knee walls, plinths, steps, platforms, staircases, the spillage of the domestic, simple architecture that causes pauses and elongates thresholds as architect Balakrishna Doshi calls it, the ambiguity of public and private, constant territorialization and deterritorialization, along with the people who adapt and adopt these spaces, assemblage. Fully formed, determined, zoned architecture cannot facilitate these socio-spatial relationships. While I hone in on in situ replacement as a solution to displacement, my focus is on the space between the buildings where social systems are nurtured by negotiating space through minor and major adaptation. In configurations with repeatable structural and services framework, flexibility was explored in place of a rigid plan by introducing voids and using adaptable building components in the form of adjustable window fronts and demountable walls. Placed at the alley interface, these create flexible spaces that can be adapted to suit socioeconomic contingencies. The built form acts as a framework with the floor line from above and circulation placed at the periphery, acting as markers to keep adaptation and expansion in check. Adaptable windows and demountable walls are fabricated on site by residents with construction know-how, using low-tech methods and salvaged materials. Flexibility at the ground level implies addition of plinth, making of porches, again, elongating thresholds so homes go beyond its walls. Windows form shop fronts and walls are moved to create spaces for eateries, workshops, parking, storage. Expansion to add extra living or sleeping space occurs at levels above. I tested 3 configurations for flexibility, each differing in circulation pattern and the capacity to add or subtract units. Nevertheless, tweaking of the configuration depends on the site itself, as can be seen here. On the left, architecture is a composite of rigid and adaptable components. The open space between the built form becomes a canvas to be filled in with transient or permanent uses, as seen in the right image. There are no unfinished houses or half houses, but there is room for flexibility, for contingency, and with that individual expression and long-term participation, not as a formal imposition, but as an everyday practice of co-production. The architectural framework of co-production legitimizes usage and appropriation while still regulating within its boundaries. At an urban scale, the section demonstrates middle ground integrating into the surrounding. Terrace Chiampelas on the left is roped into the continuum with the pedestrian connectivity established between the terrace and the site through the mall. The heights of the built form in line with the kampong and permeable interfaces that face the existing alley on the right are intended to erode class-based distinctions between the new development and the kampong. Middle ground tactically considers the front line of the site facing the mall and its positioning next to the kampong by forming a commercial interface with the mall on the left, while aligning with the right residential interface on the kampong on the right. The more formal commercial program from the left gives way to mixed-use buildings, programs which flourish under flexible conditions without formal zoning. Porous interfaces facing the existing alley in the kampong as against boundary walls spatializes the continuum of the city, building resilient neighborhoods. The section cutting the length of the site summarizes the objectives of the thesis. In situ replacement, sustaining local socio-spatial practices. It also illustrates remaking of the urban fabric. Where the middle ground connects to the street, the setback allows for seating spaces for the many street vendors on Jalan Plesiran. The Kampung Collective gathers and operates out of an open access building that also functions as a communal prayer space with vertical hydroponics. An existing badminton court, the open space, and the football pitch operates in tandem as a sports precinct. The football pitch allows for placement of in situ sanitation infrastructure. The open space is envisioned to become home to temporary installations, architecture for community organized events. Secondary systems of sanitation infrastructure, terraced wetlands, utilizes the topography and forms an ecological system with the proposed river corridor, which is negotiated to be a plant nursery or a bamboo plantation that is run and maintained for public use by the Kampung Collective. I'll conclude with this illustration of co-production. Participation in placemaking, co-production, in the context of cities of Global South already exists as an informal method, which is quite successful in generating social value. The proposition I'm making is that in the context of kampungs being replaced, formal urban planning and architecture see it as a homegrown alternative and possibly a sustainable development method of practice and design. Thank you everyone for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you, Archana, for another very interesting research. So let's now move to question and answer session. I see one hand raised by Noah Tarigan. Noah? Oh, it's gone. Let's see, Greg Feely. Greg, Pak Greg, you there?
Yes, hopefully you can hear me now.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Samira and Archana, for your presentations. My question was to Samira, and it was a really interesting set of research findings that you had. I suppose my question was not so much about the black letter law, but rather about the question of whether it's deliberate. So you mentioned the kind of Dutch tradition, legal tradition, which really didn't predispose Indonesia perhaps to having strong corporate laws. But I wonder, just looking at how powerful corporate magnates are in the ruling coalition, and also just looking with what happened with the Anti-Corruption Commission, the KPK, a few years ago, where one of the arguments put forward to reduce the powers of the KPK was to say that it was impacting on economic growth. It was scaring businesses away from development and of being caught up in prosecution and things like that. So remove some of the teeth from the Anti-Corruption Commission and the economy would grow more quickly. So if those were elements in other cases, when it comes to the Indonesian parliament, do they have an interest in strengthening laws regarding corporations? Because you said it was the corporations under-regulated, individuals over-regulated. But do the people who fund a lot of parties and politicians, do they really want legal change like that? And is that one of the big reasons why there may not be much reform of the law in this sector? Because the corporations are happy for individuals to be the fall guys for this. And perhaps they pick their victims very carefully too. These are not people who are well connected. These are people who are dispensable within a corporation, like, what was his name, Dudung Purwadi or someone like that you talked about at the start. So that's my question or questions.
Thanks, Greg. Very big question. That's okay. You've definitely hit on one of the limitations of the final chapter of my thesis in terms of proposals for reform, and that's a practical one, which is the legislature or the executive are going to push back and are resistant to law reform, and I think we've definitely seen that in practice. But the tension that you're really hitting on is what's the relationship between enforcement or the regulatory system and companies which are effectively private actors. With the example that I gave, one of the government officials was convicted. You might have heard of him, Nazaruddin. He was convicted and paid a fine, but what we saw was that he was closely affiliated with a relevant political party at the time. He was the treasurer, and it was also at a time where I think there was a lot of issues with availability of funding for political parties at the time, which I think Marcus Metzner writes about as well. So there's definitely a relationship between government, corporations, and the ability to enforce corporate crime. From a theoretical perspective, what I would say is that rule of law is designed to deliver equality in two ways. Firstly, through a horizontal relationship between within the private sphere, within citizens to citizens, and secondly, in a vertical relationship between the private and the public sphere, so the state to the citizen. And companies should be treated as actors within the private sphere and therefore bound by those relationships. So theoretically, or the theory says that these companies should be held to the same standard as individuals. And what Justice Kirby says is that there's a black hole in criminal liability, regardless of whether it's Indonesia or Australia. That's where the law does not run. And it's a circular phenomenon whereby what happens in the private sphere actually inadvertently shapes the regulatory landscape. So, for example, if bribery continues to occur, it's going to make the regulatory landscape, it will undermine the regulatory landscape. So what I've argued is that the enforcement institutions need to be equipped to respond to that. Obviously, and as you've mentioned, the KPK has been severely weakened. And one of the reasons is, as you mentioned, we still need the economy to continue to operate. So from a practical perspective, reform is difficult, especially because the draft criminal code has really been in contestation for years. So I think, in short, there's not really a clear answer to how to avoid or circumvent that problem. And that's, again, probably because the desire for reform just isn't there. And so whether there's practical ways to achieve that did exceed the scope of my thesis. And as I mentioned in my thesis, it is something to be further researched.
Thank you, Samira. Next is Peter Macaulay. Pak Peter? Ya, silakan Pak Peter.
Am I muted now? You can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, terima kasih. I have a question to both Samira and Archana, and thank you very much for your presentations. I'm an economist, so what you said to me was very interesting because it goes beyond some of the sorts of things that economists are used to. But although, of course, there is quite a strong overlap between economics and law in the sort of area that Samira was talking about, and in the area of Archana, it sounded to me like a big project. So economists are interested in projects. Now, I have a question to both of you, which is rather similar, and you might expect this coming from an economist. And my question really is, what will all of this cost and who will pay? But more generally, could you say something, each of you, Samira and Archana, about costs of the activity? You did not mention costs. And if so, how are we going to pay for these things? And the reason I am worried is that, as we economists have written about Indonesia, note the capacity of the financial capacity of the state seems very weak. Taking about 10% of GDP, the ability, the budget of government seems slim. But just let me sharpen this. Samira, you talked about, for example, the establishment of regulatory institutions. My immediate response to that is we will need a budget for that. Can you say anything about the budget? What sort of level are you thinking of? 100 million a year, 200? I mean, the Ministry of Finance will say, what do you want? What is the budget? Please tell us, and how do we fund it? The second similar question to Archana. If I'm not mistaken, Archana, your discussion looked to me like a large urban project. The figure of $300 million springs into my mind. Maybe I'm wrong, but do you have any budget in mind? And if so, how would it be apportioned? How much goes to government? How much goes to the private sector? And how do we fund this big project? So similar questions to both of you. Thank you very much. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Peter. Can we go to you first, Archana?
Yeah, okay. So the site area is about 6,400 square meters, and it's already been bought by the mall developer who's intending to expand the mall. So the architectural proposition, I'm an architectural student, so the architectural proposition that I was making was, that the architect or the architectural practice rather needs to get out of its comfort zone, and rather than just designing with a brief that a mall developer would end up giving, let's say, an architect, you question the brief and you figure out who's been impacted, because there are a lot of stakeholders involved in the site that I was looking at. There are the kampung residents who would be paid a compensation by the mall developer and would be pushed to the urban fringes. So I don't really have a figure in mind. I didn't really research into a figure, but the idea was that the mall developer would be funding the project himself, and instead of building an extra mall over there, a mall space over there, a housing development, which from where the mall developer can actually make money by selling off a majority of the share to private residents, to private buyers, but maintaining a smaller share of it to house the residents who have been displaced from there. So that's sort of the proposition that I was putting forward. And the displaced residents, the way they would fund it is, they probably would get subsidies from the government. And I also should mention that the mall has been evicting this particular patch of land for the last 10 years. So I'm thinking the mall developer would be considering the amount of money he's lost over the last 10 years. So he would probably want to, have a different kind of a business plan where he would actually provide replacement housing for the residents in situ, to avoid legal cases that have been filed against the developer. And yeah, I think that is probably what would entice him to actually provide replacement housing. So I don't know if that actually answered your question about how it was going to be funded. I don't have a number, but that was the idea of funding. That was the idea as an architect I would take to the mall developer as a proposition.
Thanks, Archana. Samira?
Thank you. My first response is I'm terrified by this question because I chose to do law because I was terrible at maths and economics, but I will give it a shot. I will also say that doing a cost analysis did exceed the scope of my thesis, primarily because it's not within my discipline. So I did avoid doing an analysis of that on that basis. But from a practical perspective, with the similar enforcement approach in Australia that I mentioned with the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, their policy of why not litigate or why not enforce all, that was supported by approximately, I think off the top of my head, AUD 2 million. Whether they needed all of that, whether they utilised all of that is another question. And whether the enforcement efforts actually led to recovery of costs as well as economic harm was achieved is also something to be further researched. But I would make 2 points in terms of the Indonesian context. Firstly, eradicating corruption, if that was achieved, which I'm saying is I'm not saying that's going to be achieved anytime soon, but if that was achieved, wouldn't that make more funds available to the state? The other point I would say is the ability to recover the economic loss is from these corporations. That's really vested in the state, in the courts, in the courts. As I mentioned, the primary remedy in these cases is restitution, and usually it's a fine payable to the state. So theoretically, the funds could be made available if the court could effectively implement the regulations in the corporate criminal liability framework. And what I discussed in my thesis in much more detail than today is the ability of courts to actually achieve that, because the legislator hasn't equipped them with the law, the statute, to successfully interpret and apply or attribute liability from the individual to the corporation. So if we wanted to do it cheaply, why not improve the capacity of the courts to actually find against these companies? But separately, and I'm not sure if this comes into the economic analysis, is what about the funds that victims have been deprived of by reason of the commission of these corporate crimes? Sometimes they're not even aware of the commission of the crime. And so actually the basis or the imperative to prosecute does not arise until much later. So for me, a cost benefit or an economic analysis for the reforms definitely exceeds the scope of my thesis, but it is something that I agree needs to be assessed for reform to be implemented.
Thank you, Samira. Next is Jeremy Kingsley. Jeremy?
Am I unmuted now? I think I'm unmuted.
Yep.
Great. Thanks to both papers. They were excellent. My question's to Samira, and this is a little bit about the act of comparison and some of the presuppositions we may have to the act of comparison. Because we may have a lot of critiques of Indonesia's reform project, but in the corporate law realm in Australia, we have nothing much to celebrate either. And the two key examples I'll give to you are obvious ones, but the Banking Royal Commission, in which almost nothing has come of it. And the second one is the fact that just now, once again, the Integrity Commission has been shelved by the Commonwealth Government. So my question to you is, are we sometimes being a little bit too tough on Indonesian regulators when we don't have an equivalent of the KPK, full stop? So are we actually, when you're making a comparison, is the comparison fair? Or are we actually presuming a few too many things?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think this is a really good point, and it is a qualification I make in the thesis. Firstly, I have noted that both countries have actually only successfully prosecuted or convicted a company for bribery once in each country. So it's not to say that Australia is more successful in enforcing corporate criminal liability than Indonesia. The second point is that there's a reason that I chose the words reflecting on rather than championing the Australian developments, and that's because Australia is not leading the way in corporate criminal liability reform. For example, the US and the UK are much more successful in enforcing corporate criminal liability than we are. Yeah, but the point to be made in this particular comparison is that there has already been an inquiry and recommendations made for reforming the Australian Criminal Code Part 2.5. The unfortunate reality is that hasn't been implemented, but it is still early stages. I mean, the report was only just over 12 months ago. So whether those reforms will be implemented, that may then lead to a greater way to say that Australia has achieved more than Indonesia in terms of reform. But the key point in terms of Indonesia and Australia in this context is that Australia has the provisions. They might not be fantastic, but they are there in one piece of statute that does have authority and is enforceable in the court, whereas Indonesia has regulations that don't even rank on the hierarchy of laws. So I definitely agree in making the comparisons. It needs to be fairer, and it does need to be made with qualification. But another reason why I thought my analysis was fairer than others is because although there are differences in terms of the whether each country follows thick or thin rule of law, which one is more democratic than the other, the point to be made is that both systems recognise equitable enforcement as the criterion of rule of law, and that should be the departure point for the analysis. So I hope that answered the question.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Samira and Jeremy. Next, we have question from Amanda Ahmadi. Let me check with Amanda if she wants to ask the question directly. Amanda, you're there?
Yes, I'm happy to ask directly.
Please go ahead.
And maybe quickly, if I may extend the earlier conversation about the cost benefit analysis. Cities in Indonesia have tremendously benefit from the existence of the kampung. That this has never been quantified sufficiently. Kampung offer affordability of housing, accessibility, and walkability. In terms of absorbing the ecological footprints of the city through the existence of kampung, this is also the benefit that has not been quantified. And there is, since 2007, the Ministry of Public Work and social housing in Indonesia has a specific funding allocated for the poor urban neighborhood. And this is tied into, of course, the power of the urban poor through the election process. This is a major constituent. Ahok lost the election because he underestimated the power of the urban poor in Jakarta. So I think there is this hidden value, this immense social capital of the kampung. And Archana, my question is about how your project developed a certain legibility of the kampung that has been consistently marginalized and rendered as non-subject. Through the history, colonial and post-colonial history. Now, I just want you to reflect back. When you arrive in Bandung in 2019, how do you grapple with the condition that is so complex and start kind of establishing legibility of how we can analyze and read the kampung without surrendering to this language of architecture that you are critiquing, the power of symbolical capital of architecture? That tends to, if you read kampung according to the visual language of architecture, the kampung will be dismissed as, what are we talking about? This is a mess, this is disorder, this is poverty. So just wanting you to reflect back on that, forming that legibility.
Thank you, Amanda. Archana?
I think back in 2019, when I first visited the kampung, more than the architectural language of the kampung itself, what hit me was the kind of social relationships, the kind of social value that was created within, corners and pockets and, alleys of the kampung. And that sort of ended up, I sort of ended up connecting spatiality to the social experience that I was having, rather than going via the spatial experience and then connecting it to the social values. So that's one of the first things that I actually remember about the kampungs. Going to the question of the limit of this, the legibility of the kampung itself and the urban form of the kampung itself. Creating new legibility, I think one of the issues could actually be that of open spaces within the kampung, and also of accessibility, like in terms of, with the project, in terms of, even access for construction, access for provision of services and things like that, which we normally, end up thinking, we kind of need like really wide roads to be able to access a place. And then that's not really how things work in the kampung. So when there is a new kind of a form that's created, almost like a new kampung, I think some of those things will actually end up getting compromised. So that could actually be a limit of that. And the other thing, again, just going back to the social aspect of it, I think with the project itself, there is sort of a limitation in actually understanding what the actual aspirations of the stakeholders there are. So, there is a lack of visualization of putting two different social classes together in one architecture. It's a particularly difficult thing to visualize. And so it seems idealistic as well to put two disparate kind of conditions together. So that kind of is always, I mean, is possibly also, limiting in expressing the legibility of the kampung. I don't know if I, again, answered your question, Amanda.
Thank you, Archana. And thank you also, Samira, for your very inspiring presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Amanda. Any other questions or comments? No? All right. So I think it has been a good presentation and discussion. Thank you, Samira and Archana. For those who attend, also thank you so much. And with this, I'll turn this over to Lydia, who has an announcement. Over to you, Lydia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for participants. And as you know, this is the research has been supported with a research travel grant from ANU Indonesia project. And we're happy to announce that we are opening another round of grants. So if you are interested, please check out our website. The deadline is still a long ways. It's just open yesterday. So the deadline is 3 April. So feel free to apply. And this is for travel, but we can adjust if travel is not possible, as our presenters have shown. So that's it from me. Before I close the Zoom, I'll flag up the flyer about the travel grants. We have another one actually, which is the Rusman grant, and you can also check that out on our website. That's it from me. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for attending. Thank you for speakers for allocating time to present.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today as well.
Very much.